You can stay on and help with the chickens. Help with the garden. We'll put you on $200 a month, and everybody gets along fine. That was how Marcus Colefield's brothers told him the family farm, 114 acres their grandfather had left them, would never be his. Help. They said it like he was hired labor, not the boy that old man had raised at that same kitchen table. Marcus didn't argue. He just left. And with the last $340 to his name, he drove to a county auction and bought the one thing nobody else in Harland would touch. 8/10 of an acre buried under a wall of dead thorn. $10. Sold. 1 year later, that ruined little field was worth more than everything his brothers kept. Why? Because of what a dead woman had buried under all that thorn and left waiting for whoever was desperate enough to dig. The deed took 30 days to process, but Marcus had known the shape of the thing 4 minutes into that auction. Gerald, the clerk in the bolo tie, had read the legal description off a laminated sheet in the flat voice of a man who expected nothing to come of it. Lot 9, Section 4, 8/10 of an acre, County Road 7, delinquent on taxes since 2019. He had looked at the empty chairs. He had looked at his sheet. He had said sold and stamped something, and he had not looked at Marcus once during any of it, which was fine. Marcus had grown used to being in rooms where people forgot to look at him. He wrote the check at the counter afterward, $10 against the $360 that sat in his account at First Cumberland, and folded the receipt into the inside pocket of his grandfather's barn coat. Olive canvas, the lining torn at the left shoulder. It was the one thing of the old man's that Marcus had taken without asking, and nobody had come looking for it. He sat in the truck a while with the heater running before he drove out. The truck was a 2003 Dodge Dakota, dark green, 211,000 miles on the original engine, and it was his. It was his because his grandfather had left it to him by name in a separate clause, the only thing in the entire will with Marcus's name attached to it. Everything else, the whole of Coalfield Farm, 114 acres, the equipment and the outbuildings, and the cattle and the mineral rights, had gone to Dex and Garrett. Dex was 27, Garrett was 24. They were the old man's blood, and Marcus was the boy the old man had brought home and raised. And in the eyes of the law and the eyes of his brothers, those were two different things, no matter how many years Marcus had eaten at that table. His grandfather had never made him feel the difference. That was the thing Marcus kept returning to. The old man had taught him to drive on the tractor lane behind the north field, had shown him how to read weather off the ridge line, had left him the coat and the truck like a man leaving a son something to remember him by. But the will had been written when Marcus was still a minor, before anyone thought the old man's heart would give out in a doctor's parking lot on an ordinary Wednesday, and the old man had died before he ever got around to changing it. And so a document written years too early had spoken louder than a lifetime, and Marcus had learned that his place at Coalfield had always been a thing that could be revised. He had not been angry at the auction. He had spent the anger already, back in February, in the first week after the kitchen. Anger was expensive, and he could not afford it. So what he carried instead by the time he bought the field was something quieter and more useful, a kind of patience with a hard edge to it. The kitchen had been 2 months earlier. Dex had done the talking, the way Dex always did, leaning against the counter with his coffee while Garrett stood near the back door and studied his own boots. Dex did not say anything unkindly. That was the strange part, the part Marcus turned over for a long time afterward. Dex laid it out the way a man lays out a budget. The farm's mine and Garrett's now, that's just how the will fell. We're gonna run it together, and there's always work needs doing. You want to stay on? Help with the chickens and the garden? Some of the lighter field work? There's a room for you, and we'll put your name on a little something every month. Everybody gets along fine. Help. He used the word 3 times in the space of 2 sentences, and Marcus counted them, standing there on the same linoleum he had crossed 10,000 times as a boy, the same row of coat hooks by the back door, his grandfather's barn coat still hanging on the 3rd hook from the left. "What's the allowance?" Marcus said. It was not really a question. "200 a month." Dex said it the way a person says something he expects to be accepted without discussion. That was when Marcus understood it was not a negotiation. It was a notification. Dex was not offering him a place in the family. Dex was offering him a job, and a small one, at a wage that made plain what the family thought his help was worth. There was no cruelty in it, and somehow that was worse than cruelty. Cruelty would have meant they were thinking about him. This was the sound of two men who had already stopped. He left 4 days later. He did not make a scene because a scene was a thing you made when you still believed the room might change its mind, and Marcus no longer believed that. He took the Dakota and a duffel bag and his notebooks and the cast iron skillet his grandmother had used until her hands got too stiff to lift it. He took the barn coat off the third hook. He did not take anything else, and nobody stopped him at the door, and that told him everything the will already had. For 2 months after that, he rented a room in town off a woman on Miners Creek Road, $60 a week, which meant that his grandfather's separate insurance bequest, the money left to him apart from the farm, was going out steadily with nothing at all coming in. The bequest had started at $820. By the middle of February, it had become $340, and Marcus could watch the arithmetic of it running down like water in a cracked basin, and he knew that at $60 a week, the basin would be empty before the ground thawed. He needed something that was his, not on loan, not conditional, not a room somebody could ask him to leave. He needed a thing with his name on the deed, the way the truck had his name in the clause, a thing no revised document could take back. And a man with $340 does not get to be particular about what that thing looks like. So when he saw the county's list of tax-delinquent parcels posted outside the clerk's office, he read it the way he read everything now, slowly, all the way down. Most of the lots were tied up in something, but Lot 9, Section 4, off County Road 7, had a minimum bid of $20, and a note that no back interest would be pursued against a new owner. And Marcus knew that stretch of road. He had ridden it his whole childhood with his face against the cold window glass, watching the ridge come and go, and he had never once thought about who owned the scrubby fields on either side of it. That was the whole of his plan the morning of the auction. Buy something. Own it outright. Stop the bleeding. He had not walked the land. He did not know if it was flat or broken, wet or dry, or what grew on it, or whether anything grew on it at all. He knew only that it was under $20, and that no living person seemed to want it. And to Marcus, in that February, those two facts felt less like a warning and more like an opening. The bidding, when it came, was him against no one. 20, he said. Gerald asked if there were any other bids and looked at the 11 empty chairs and answered his own question. And it was done. Marcus walked back out into a gray February morning that was not especially interested in what had just happened to him, and that suited him. He had spent enough of his life being interesting to people who would not help him. He was ready to be a man nobody watched for a while. He drove north out of Harland on County Road 7, past the point where it stopped being a road anyone bothered to maintain, and he pulled the Dakota onto the shoulder when he saw the cedar brake he half remembered from childhood. Then he cut the engine and sat with his hands in his lap, because he understood that once he got out and looked, the thing would become real, and he wanted one more moment of it being only a receipt in his pocket and a number in his head. When he did get out, the first thing he noticed was the sound, or the absence of it. The cedar brake along the north edge killed the road noise almost at once, and inside that quiet, the land kept its own small sounds. A sparrow working through dry brush, the tick of cedar branches against each other, his boots on frozen ground. The second thing he noticed was that the blackberry had taken the whole of it. Not a weedy field with some canes at the edges. A wall, 4 feet high in most places, dead and dormant and brown in February, thick enough that a man could not see where the ground went underneath, or whether it was flat or broken or good for anything at all. He walked the perimeter first, because the perimeter was the only part he could walk. The edges kept low over the years by the county mowing crew just enough to mark the boundary. The fence was cedar post, older than anything, most of it down, the barbed wire gone slack and half returned to the soil, woven through with blackberry root as if the land had quietly decided to take it back. In the southeast, a gap in the canopy showed him a patch of actual ground, darker than he expected, darker than the soil along the road. He did not know what that meant. He noted it anyway, the way his grandfather had taught him to note things he did not yet understand. On the western edge, he found a shallow depression, 8 or 12 feet across, so subtle he nearly stepped into it before he saw it, holding a little standing water from the last rain. The blackberry grew right to its rim and then stopped, and Marcus stood at the edge looking down, not knowing that the stopping was itself a kind of signal. He wrote it down without knowing. Low spot. Drainage or something else. He was back at the truck when the fence wire shifted behind him, and he turned to find an older woman standing at the property line on the far side of what remained of the 3-strand fence, wearing a brown canvas coat and holding a green thermos in one hand. She was not looking at him with concern or curiosity or any of the expressions he had learned to expect from people who watched him do things. She was only looking at the land. He walked toward her and she waited, and she did not introduce herself as a neighbor. She held the thermos out over the sagging wire. "You look cold," she said. He was. He took it. The coffee was black and very hot, and he drank 2 swallows and handed it back, and she poured a capful for herself, and the two of them stood on either side of that ruined fence in the flat gray light without saying much of anything at all. She watched a crow cross the field from west to east, and he watched it with her, and neither of them felt any need to fill the quiet. The woman's name was Ruth, and Marcus learned it before she turned back toward her own land. She had lived on the parcel to the north for 43 years, since she married, and she had known the woman who once owned Marcus's 8/10 of an acre back when that woman still had a garden worth knowing. Ruth said all of this the way she said everything, without looking at him, watching the field instead, and when Marcus told her what he was thinking of doing with the lot, she nodded once, as if it confirmed something she had already decided about him. She did not say good luck. She did not say it was a lot of work for one man alone. "I've got a broad fork you can borrow," she said. "That soil doesn't want to till it. It wants to be opened, not broken. You'll know the difference when you feel it. Come by Tuesday." Then she picked up her thermos and walked back across her field, and Marcus wrote that down too, the way he was writing everything down now. He went by Tuesday. She handed the broad fork over the fence post without ceremony. 2 times, worn wooden handles, the steel darkened from decades of use, and Marcus carried it back and set it against the Dakota's tailgate and stood a while looking at what he had bought. It took him the better part of 3 weeks just to learn the shape of the place. The brush mower came first, a walk-behind machine he found on Facebook for $85, hauled to the lot in the bed of a stranger's pickup on a Thursday in early March. The seller threw in a spare belt and told him to keep the blade clear of wet cane, and the thing started on the 3rd pull. Marcus ran it 6 hours that first day, back and forth across the eastern third of the lot, stopping every 20 minutes to clear wrapped cane out of the blade housing with a stick. The blackberry came out in mats. The cedar scrub was younger than it looked, the roots shallow enough that he could lever them free with Ruth's broad fork once the mower had knocked them down, and he learned quickly what she had meant about opening the ground instead of breaking it. He worked from first light until he could not trust his footing in the dark, and he did not count the hours. He counted the rows. By the 2nd week, he had reached the center of the lot, and by the 3rd, he had pushed into the northwest corner, where the cedar stood thickest and the ground fell away in a way he had not seen from the road. The slope was slight, maybe 8 inches across 15 feet, but it was steady, and the soil there was darker than anywhere else he had turned, dense and almost black, the kind of color a man does not see much in that part of Kentucky without having done something to earn it. He was clearing the last of a cedar cluster when the mower's front wheel dropped. Not far, 4 or 5 inches, but the frame tilted and he cut the engine at once and knelt and pulled back a curtain of cane root with his gloved hands, and under it he found the edge of something. A timber, rotted nearly to fiber, running parallel to the ground and angling down. He cleared it by hand after that, an hour with a hand mattock and another half-hour pulling root, and what came out of the ground was a depression roughly 8 feet by 5, its perimeter lined with stacked fieldstone. The timber had been a door frame. The door itself had fallen inward and rotted almost flat, and Marcus could see the ghost of its planks pressed into the soil like a photograph of a thing that was no longer there. A root cellar. Hand-dug, hand-lined, built before anyone in his family had set foot in the county. The smell that came up out of it was cold and mineral and airless, the smell of a place where nothing had drawn breath in a very long time, and Marcus climbed down into it carefully, testing each stone with his boot before he trusted his weight to it. That was when he saw the box. It was olive drab, military surplus, about the size of a shoebox but heavier, with a swing bale latch that locked down over a steel loop, and the rubber gasket around its lid had held all these years. Marcus felt it resist when he worked the latch free, felt the small sigh of pressure letting go, the sound a sealed jar makes when the seal finally gives. Inside, everything was dry. He carried it up out of the cellar into the failing amber light and set it in the truck bed, and then he did the only thing that made sense to him, which was to drive it to Ruth. It was past 4 when he got there, and she opened the door before he had finished knocking, the way people do when they have heard a vehicle on their gravel and already know. She put water on for coffee without asking, and he set the box on her kitchen table under the yellow oilcloth worn white at the corners, and he opened it there beneath the overhead light while she sat across from him. Inside was a folded canvas pouch, and inside the pouch a small hand tool, hand-forged by the look of the handle, with 2 letters scratched into the metal. E.V. Below the pouch lay a notebook, composition style, its cover water-stained but whole, and beneath the notebook a small paper envelope folded flat, the kind seed companies once sold singles in. Ruth reached out and touched the cover of the notebook before Marcus opened it, only her fingertips, the way a person touches a shoulder. The first entry was dated the 3rd of April, 1951. The handwriting was small and controlled, more precise than he had expected, laid out almost in columns. A date, a description of what had been amended and where, what came up, what did not. The woman who had written it had kept records like a scientist, 20 years of them, entry by entry through 1971, and Marcus read slowly with Ruth leaning over the table beside him. Eunice Vestal, Ruth said when he reached a page where the writer had signed a full name at the bottom of a season's summary. She grew the best pole beans in this county off that little piece. Built her own trellis, cedar posts, and baling wire. People used to ask where she got her seed, and she'd just smile. Ruth told him Eunice had slowed down in the early 70s, her knees going. She passed in 87. Place has just been sitting ever since. Marcus did the arithmetic in his head. 36 years of blackberry cane and cedar scrub had grown up over the top of whatever Eunice Vestal had spent 20 years building, and it had waited under all of it for someone who needed it. On page 41, midway through the entries for 1959, a line had been underlined twice. The dark corner never fails, deep black to 18 inches at minimum, always first to drain, never waterlogged. Below it, a rough pencil sketch, nothing to scale, a rectangle divided into quadrants with the strong corner marked in the northeast. Marcus looked at Ruth, and Ruth looked at the page. "That sounds exactly right," she said. She used to call that corner her insurance. Then Marcus picked up the seed envelope, its pencil writing faded almost to nothing, and Ruth took it from him and read it under the light without her glasses, which surprised him. She set it down carefully. "Zinnias," she said. She spent years on these, selecting seed every fall, crossing for color, for stem length. Never sold them. Never gave the variety to a soul outside that fence line. The envelope was still full. Marcus tilted it and felt the seeds shift inside, dry and small and light, waiting. He planted the garlic first, on the first Saturday of March, A morning cold enough that his breath came in short white puffs, and the ground resisted the broad fork until he leaned his whole weight onto it. He worked the northeast corner ahead of anywhere else, and the soil there was exactly what the notebook had promised. Dark and deep, giving way in long, clean slices, nothing like the compacted gray clay along the western edge where the cedar had been thickest. He pushed the fork to its full depth at every station and wrote down the difference the way Eunice would have. Northeast quadrant, 17 to 19 inches workable, black, no hard pan. Southwest edge, 9 inches, then clay. He had bought 4 pounds of seed garlic from the farm and feed store on Pine Mountain Street, a hardneck variety, $8 a pound, and he set it 6 inches apart in rows and marked the end of each row with a cedar stick cut from his own brushwork. He had 63 of those posts by the second week of March, rough and uneven but sound, and he drove them with a borrowed post maul that left his palms bruised for 4 days. He fenced 3 sides with salvaged woven wire he found rolled against the back wall of a collapsed shed on the lot itself. Old wire stiff with surface rust but heavy gauge, holding tension without breaking. The work did something to him that he had not expected. In the mornings, he woke sore in muscles he had not known he owned, and by the time the light came up over the ridge, he was already at the fence line, and there was a plainness to the days that he found he needed. Nobody watched him. Nobody offered him $200 a month to be grateful. The blackberry did not care whose blood he was, and the clay did not soften faster for anyone born inside the family than it did for him. And there was a fairness in that hard, indifferent ground that he had not found anywhere with people. He began to sleep better than he had since the kitchen. The hens came in early April. 6 buff Orpington pullets he drove 40 minutes each way to Cumberland to buy, $8 apiece, $48 in all, riding home in a complaining cardboard box. He had built their coop the week before out of scrap lumber off that same collapsed shed. Rough work, but square enough, with a hardware cloth window and a latch that actually caught. They settled the first night almost at once, and he took that as a reasonable sign. That evening he opened his own notebook, a plain composition book he had bought at the dollar store in February, and he wrote out every number of the past 6 weeks. Garlic, $32. Wire staples and gate hardware, $19. The pullets, $48. His balance at First Cumberland had fallen to $44, and he wrote that number down and looked at it a while, and then he wrote the date beside it and closed the book. He was closer to zero than he had ever been in his life, and stranger still, he was not afraid. The field was his. No revised document could reach it. By the first week of May, the garlic had told him the truth about the corner. Everywhere across the lot it looked fine, healthy and upright. In the northeast quadrant, it looked like something unseen was tending it, a full hand's width taller, the leaves a deeper color, the stems thicker at the base. Eunice had recorded that difference year after year across 20 seasons and never once explained the cause of it. She had only kept the fact. Whatever she understood about that ground had gone with her in 1987, and so Marcus set out to find it himself. He had a length of half-inch rebar left over from fencing, sharpened to a rough point, and on a morning after 2 days of rain, with the ground soft enough to probe, he began at the western edge and pushed the bar down every 2 feet, listening for what it struck. Mostly it struck nothing of interest. Soft soil, then clay, then the resistance of bedrock depth. But about 18 inches in from the western fence line, he found something else, a hollow give, and then a stop that was not clay. And when he probed the same line north and south, he found it again at the same depth, running straight. He fetched a shovel. 14 inches down, he hit fired clay tile, 4-inch agricultural drainage, fitted together in short sections, still seated, still intact, still doing the work it had been put in the ground to do sometime before he was born. He sat back on his heels in the wet soil and looked at it a long time. The land had been working this whole time quietly on its own, and he had simply been too new to know where to look. Eunice had laid that tile so the northeast corner would drain and never waterlog, and 36 years of neglect had not stopped it. He was not building something from nothing. He was uncovering something somebody wiser had already built, and there was a comfort in that he had not expected to feel. It was while he was learning what he actually held that the second understanding came to him. He had gone into the county library one rainy afternoon to look up how a person sells produce legally at the market, what permits the state wanted, and how the tax on it worked. And the reference librarian, a helpful woman who liked a puzzle, had walked him back to the agricultural shelves and gotten curious about the old notebook he carried under his arm. He had shown her a page or two, only meaning to ask what a couple of the abbreviations stood for, and she had ended up steering him toward a shelf on heirloom and open pollinated varieties, on the difference between a plant anyone could buy and a plant that existed nowhere else on Earth. He read for 2 hours and forgot about the permits entirely, and somewhere in that reading it settled on him, slow, and then all at once, that a documented heirloom variety, one strain a single grower had spent 20 years selecting and had never once released, backed by 2 decades of written records proving exactly where it came from and how it had been bred, was not a row of flowers. It was a thing of real and rare value, and it was sitting in a paper envelope in the inside pocket of a dead man's barn coat. For the first time, Marcus let himself think the word asset, and then he put the thought away, because the seeds were more than 50 years old and might not come up at all, and a man with $44 does not spend it counting money that does not yet exist. He planted the zinnias in a separate row along the fence in late April, uncertain any of them would take, and then he waded through a May that came in dry the first week and wet the second. The kind of alternating pattern that has a man watching the sky every morning before he does anything else. It was late June, the garlic sending up scapes and the tomato plants past his knee, the lot finally looking less like abandoned ground and more like something deliberate, when he heard a truck slow on County Road 7 and knew the engine before he looked up. A 2019 Ram, dark gray, the Coalfield Farm magnetic sign on the door that Dex had made up 2 summers back. Garrett. He pulled onto the shoulder and left it running, and Marcus stood up from the bean row and waited. Garrett leaned out the window and looked at the fence, the tomato cages, the 6 hens working the far corner, and then at Marcus. "Looks like a lot of work for a small piece of ground," Garrett said. "It is," said Marcus. "Been talking with Dex." Garrett let the truck idle. "We were thinking, you want to get out from under it, we could probably work something out. Fold the lot into the farm's boundary, give you something fair for what you put in." "I'm not trying to be funny about it. I'm being practical. This place doesn't have the infrastructure for a real operation. You'd be better positioned to build something if you weren't stretched so thin." He meant it. That was the thing about Garrett. He almost always meant what he said, and it did not make him right. There was a thing under the offer that Garrett would never have said out loud, and maybe did not even know he was saying, which was that this ground was not really Marcus's to make something of, that he belonged folded back into the family's boundary the way the lot did, on terms the family set. Marcus heard it. "I'm not looking to sell," Marcus said. Garrett nodded like he had expected that, but had to ask, looked at the field one more time, said Marcus had done a decent job clearing it, and put the truck back in gear and was gone. From her porch across the fence line, Ruth had watched the whole of it without leaving her chair, a glass of something cold on the porch rail, and a bowl of the last June peas in her lap. When the Ram disappeared around the bend, she took a long sip and set the glass down and did not say anything, and Marcus did not either. Some things did not need the commentary. He finished the row before the light changed. The harder blow came 3 weeks later, and it did not come from family. A man Marcus did not know called the number he had listed with the county market when he registered his stall. Friendly, unhurried. "Been by the market a couple times," the man said. "Got to talking with your manager, and he mentioned the young grower out on County Road 7, working the old Vestal place. Word travels among folks who care about old seed. I collect rare varieties. Heard there might be an heirloom zinnia line come down with that property. I'd pay a fair price to take the whole strain off your hands, envelope and all. Save you the trouble of fooling with flowers when you've plainly got your hands full with vegetables." The number the man named was small. It was the number you offer someone you assume does not know what he is holding, and Marcus understood in that moment that the man had done his homework, that he had asked the right questions of the right people, that he knew about the notebook or had guessed at it, and that he wanted the one thing on the property with a value that could not be grown back if it were sold. To take the money would erase the only thing he owned that nobody else on earth could ever own again, and it would erase it before it had ever had the chance to prove what it was. Marcus stood in the field with the phone against his ear, his balance at First Cumberland having crept back up to barely more than it had been, a season's whole gamble still unharvested, and a row of 50-year-old flowers that had not yet opened. "No," he told the man. "Thank you, but no." He hung up and he stood there a while, and he understood that he had just turned down the only certain money in reach in order to bet everything on a crop still in the ground and a flower he had never seen bloom. That night he did not sleep well for the first time in months. He lay awake doing the arithmetic of a man who has said no twice now, once to his brother and once to a stranger, and has nothing but dirt and faith to show for either refusal. The whole of the summer came down to a question Marcus could not answer with words, only with the ground. There was no way now to prove either refusal had been anything but foolish, except to let the field speak for itself. So he stopped talking about the land entirely, even to Ruth, and he let the season carry it. The beans came first. By the first week of August, the northeast quadrant was so heavy with them that he was picking every other morning just to keep the plants from going woody, 2 5-gallon buckets before 8 o'clock, and every morning the dark corner proved out exactly what Eunice had written across 20 seasons. The soil there held moisture differently, pulled it up from somewhere deeper, and the plants knew it. Then the summer squash came on in the center rows, laid in crates in the bed of the Dakota, and then the tomatoes, the brandywines he had started on a windowsill in April, coming in cracked and heavy and warm from the vine. The first Saturday he drove to the Harlan County Farmers Market on Central Street, he had guessed his produce was worth maybe $42 if he priced it fair. He sold 89. An older woman bought 3 pounds of tomatoes and came back 20 minutes later for 2 more, and Marcus drove home that afternoon with an empty truck bed and a cash envelope from the market manager and his hands shaking a little from something that was not quite exhaustion. He went back 4 Saturdays in August and 4 more in September, and he kept a running column in his notebook the same way he imagined Eunice had kept hers. Date, crop, pounds sold, price, total. By the end of September, the column read $614, and when he subtracted out the mower and the seed and the fencing and the hens and their feed and the market fee, he had $270 left in the account at First Cumberland, more than he had started with in February. He wrote that number down twice, not because he doubted it, but because he wanted to see it again. The zinnias were last, the way flowers usually are once everything else has done its work. They came up in the cutting row in early September, later than the old packet had suggested, but he had not rushed them, and when they opened, they were a deep coral orange, a color he did not have a clean word for, something between fire and clay. Ruth came to the fence the morning they bloomed and stood a long while without speaking, and Marcus understood she had known the color before they opened, and he had not. He cut a dozen for the market the last 2 Saturdays and sold every stem, and what he did not cut he let go to seed. By early October the heads were dry and papery, and he sat on the tailgate one evening cracking them open over a fresh paper envelope, the same kind Eunice had used, shaking the small seeds in and folding the top down and writing the year on the outside in marker. Then he put the envelope in the inside pocket of the barn coat and went in to make his supper. The county's fall agricultural showcase was held on the 21st of October, a Saturday, at the fairgrounds south of town. Marcus drove in before 7 with the Dakota's heater working poorly enough that he kept the barn coat buttoned to the collar. And in the bed he had a flat of garlic bulbs wrapped in burlap, a mason jar of dried zinnia heads arranged so the coral showed through the glass, and a 2-page production summary he had copied out the night before onto unlined paper. Acreage, soil amendments, yield by row, gross receipts for the season. He had also brought Eunice's notebook, though he had not planned to. It had lived in his jacket pocket most of the fall, the way some people carry a phone, and he set it beside the garlic flat at his table in the agricultural annex without quite deciding to. The extension agent who came around to each table was a tall man in his 60s named Dale Fugate, in a co-op cap, moving slowly, asking short questions and writing things down. When he reached Marcus, he looked at the garlic, looked at the summary, and asked how many square feet the garlic had occupied and what variety it was, and Marcus told him, and Fugate wrote it down. Then he saw the notebook. He did not pick it up at first. "What's this?" Fugate asked. "Belonged to the woman who owned the land before me." "How far back does it go?" 1951 to 1971. Fugate picked it up then, carefully, and turned to the first entry, and he stood at the table reading for the better part of 4 minutes without a word. Then he carried it to the 2 other people on the panel, and Marcus watched them pass it between their hands and lean over it and speak low to one another. And when they came back together, Fugate looked at him. "You find the tile drain along the western edge?" "I did. Late March." Fugate nodded once, the way a man nods when a thing he suspected turns out to be so. The young grower recognition was a small maple plaque about the size of a hardback book, Marcus's name engraved on it in block letters, and below it, the name of the showcase and the year. Fugate handed it over himself and shook Marcus's hand with both of his. "That notebook," he said, "is one of the better pieces of farm documentation I've seen in 30 years of extension work." But the plaque was not the thing that changed Marcus's life, and he knew it even standing there holding it. The thing that changed it was standing 3 feet behind Fugate, a woman who had come with the panel and had not said a word the whole time, and who introduced herself only after the crowd around the table had thinned. She worked for a regional seed conservancy, the kind of outfit that preserved and licensed heritage plant lines, and she had spent the last several minutes of the judging looking not at the garlic, but at the mason jar of coral zinnia heads and the 20 years of breeding records sitting open beside them. "That variety," she said, nodding at the jar. "Does it exist anywhere else?" Marcus told her the truth. "As far as I know, as far as the one living person who remembers Eunice Vestal knows, no. She bred it over 20 years and never released it. It's all in the notebook, season by season." He watched the woman go very still in the way a person does when they have found a thing they did not expect to find. "Can I call you next week?" she asked. She did more than call. What she laid out for Marcus over the weeks that followed was not an offer to buy a row of flowers, a documented single-origin heirloom line that had never entered the market, backed by 20 unbroken years of breeding records proving its provenance, and carried on the back of a story people would want to tell, was, in the narrow and particular world she worked in, worth far more than a season of vegetables. It was worth more, once the licensing was structured, than the number Marcus had been too careful even to say out loud in his own head. The strain and its records together, valued and put under a long-term licensing and stewardship agreement, crossed a line into 7 figures that neither Marcus nor Ruth had believed a paper envelope could hold. Marcus did not sell it. That was the part he thought about most afterward, because a younger version of himself, the one standing on the linoleum in his grandfather's kitchen being told what his help was worth, would have grabbed the first number and run. Instead, he did the thing the field had taught him to do, which was to move slowly and to keep what was his. He structured it as a license and a partnership rather than a sale, so that the conservancy could preserve and propagate the Vestal zinnia and put it into careful circulation, and Marcus kept ownership of the line, kept the notebook, and kept every inch of the 8/10 of an acre it had come out of. The $1 million, when people later called it that, had not been grown in a single year at all. It had been bred over 20 years by a woman with bad knees and buried under 36 years of thorn, and Marcus had simply been the one who needed it badly enough to dig and steady enough not to hand it away. They came the next morning, the 22nd of October, a Sunday. Marcus heard the truck before he saw it, that particular sound a diesel makes on gravel when a man is driving slower than he usually would. He was in the field pulling the last of the spent bean plants when Dex and Garrett parked along the fence on County Road 7, and both of them got out and stood at the fence line and looked at the rows. He kept working a moment longer, not to make a point, only because the beans needed finishing, and then he walked over. Neither brother spoke first. Garrett had his hands in his jacket pockets and was watching the 6 hens move through the morning light in their slow, deliberate way. Dex was looking at the garlic bed, already mulched for winter, and after a moment he opened the gate and walked in, and he went slowly down the center path between the beds, looking at the soil and not at Marcus. Near the northeast corner, the dark corner that never failed, Dex crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the earth, the way a man tests something he has heard about but not believed, and he stood back up without a word and kept walking to the far end and turned and came back. At the gate he stopped. He looked at Marcus, and then he looked at the maple plaque that Marcus had left sitting on the tailgate of the Dakota, and whatever it cost him to say what he said next, he said it quietly, and it was meant only for the 2 of them, and so it stays there. It was not a long thing. It was not even quite an apology, because Dex was not a man who knew how to shape one. But it was the sound of a man who had done arithmetic in a kitchen 2 seasons ago and gotten the answer badly wrong, standing in the middle of the proof of it. The weight of the whole thing was in how quiet the reversal was. There was no shouting, no scene, nothing Marcus had to win. The $10 field that his brothers had offered to fold back into their boundary out of something close to pity was now worth more than the 114 acres they had kept, and none of the 3 of them needed to say that number out loud for all 3 of them to know it was true. The man the family had treated as someone whose place was conditional had turned out to be the only one of them who could read what the land had left behind. "You're welcome to come back in the spring," Marcus said, "if you want to see it green." Dex nodded. He went back to the truck, and the 2 of them drove out the way they had come, slow on the gravel, and Marcus stood at the fence a while after they were gone and looked at the field. The rows were straight. The soil in the northeast quadrant was dark and loose and smelled like something that had been working a long time before he ever got there. Here is what Marcus learned that year, and what stays with a person longer than any number ever could. The people who measure your worth in a hurry are almost always measuring the wrong thing. His brothers looked at 8/10 of an acre and saw a wall of thorn and a boy in over his head. The stranger on the phone looked at an envelope of old seed and saw something cheap to take off a fool's hands. Both of them were doing the same math, the fast math, the kind that looks at what a thing appears to be worth today and never asks what it might become. And the fast math is almost always wrong, because it cannot see what is under the ground. What Marcus had instead was patience and a willingness to dig, and those 2 things are available to anyone, regardless of what they were handed or what they were denied. He did not turn that field around because he was special. He turned it around because he showed up every morning to ground that did not care who he was, and he kept notes, and he trusted the work of a woman he never met over the opinion of the people who had written him off. He refused the sure, small money not out of pride, but because he had learned, slowly, to tell the difference between what looks like a rescue and what is actually a robbery. And maybe the truest part of it is this: the most valuable thing on that whole property was not something Marcus created. It was something he had the humility to recognize, protect, and pass forward instead of cashing in. Eunice Vestal spent 20 years building it and trusted the ground to keep it safe until the right person came along. Marcus turned out to be that person, and instead of selling her life's work to the highest bidder, he kept it alive. There is a kind of wealth in that the fast math will never understand. So here is the question worth sitting with. What is buried on the piece of ground everyone else has already given up on in your life? What did somebody leave behind for you? In a barn, in a cellar, in a relative's handwriting on the back of an envelope, trusting that one day the right person would need it badly enough to dig. Because the thing about buried things is that they do not announce themselves. They wait, and they tend to reveal themselves only to the person willing to clear the thorn. If any part of Marcus and that 8/10 of an acre landed somewhere real for you, I'd love to know it. Have you ever found something valuable in a place nobody thought to look, or been counted out by people who were only doing the fast math? Tell me about it in the comments. I read them, and stories like these are exactly why. And if you know someone standing in their own version of that kitchen right now, being told what their help is worth, do them a quiet kindness and pass this along. Sometimes the thing a person needs most is the reminder that the ground everyone else walked away from might be the one thing worth digging for.